My dear friends, good day. Have you ever made a completely improbable encounter? Like running into a friend you haven't seen in 10 years? Or meeting a fellow countryman in a far, far away country? When it comes to unexpected encounters, there may be some that have you beat. We are in 326 BC, in the heart of the small kingdom of Paurava, in present-day Pakistan at the gateway to India. We can imagine that there are a handful of hunters and peasants inspecting the bank of the Hydaspe River, which is overflowing due to melting Himalayan snow. Suddenly, they see tens of thousands of soldiers from all nations. At their head, surrounded by his faithful Macedonians, stands the conquering King Alexander the Great. But it's not over yet, because in front of him, on the other side of the river, appears a second army just as impressive. It's the army of King Poros, who has gathered 60,000 infantrymen and hundreds of war elephants. What do our poor witnesses do? Maybe they immediately flee. Maybe they go back to their families to tell them that a tragedy is brewing. But not us. Stay with me, because with more than 2,300 years of difference, the Greek or Indian arrows can't reach us. We can watch this battle in total peace. But first of all, how did this whole thing start? At only 29 years old, Alexander already reigns over Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, the Near East, Persia, and South Central Asia. That's not bad for his age, but as his name indicates, he has a delusion of grandeur and decided to embark on a new conquest, that of India. This may seem logical since up to now, he has never stopped moving further and further east, and India seems to be the next step. Especially since in the eyes of the Greeks, it is a mythical country, supposed to be the home of the god Dionysus. It is also said that Heracles traveled there and defeated terrible dangers. The Persians, who have trade relations with India, also tell the Greeks that the country abounds in riches. Gold, ivory, pearls, and precious stones are produced there. And India is far away. It's mysterious. It makes you dream. Many legends circulate about the existence of fantastic animals, giants, etc. In short, as Casimir would say, it is the happy country of happy children of nice monsters. Yes, it's a paradise. So we understand better the motivation of the Greeks to discover this wonderful country. But beyond the riches, we must also concede that they are looking for a passage to the outer ocean that surrounds the world. And this is not a coincidence. Alexander in his youth was the disciple of Aristotle. It was from his master that he learned of the existence, far to the east, of an access to the ocean that allowed him to go around the world and return to Greece, bypassing Asia and Africa. Passionate about geography, the prince decides to become an explorer to see what it's all about. Nothing is better than direct experience. But the conquest of India also answers a more earthly objective: to keep the army busy. Yes, Alexander prefers that his men devote themselves to war rather than to plots against his person. And for good reason. A few months earlier, a conspiracy orchestrated by one of Alexander's pages, Hermolaus, was foiled. The culprits are tortured and then executed. But the king lives henceforth in the fear that his close relations may revolt if they remain a long time inactive. The Macedonian veterans indeed reproach their emperor for his obsessive search for the ocean, the incorporation of non-Greek soldiers in the army, and his megalomania. India is the perfect outlet, the perfect diversion for the military to think about something else. For Alexander, it's really a headlong rush. Alexander thus gathers 120,000 men. This army is the most cosmopolitan in history, and the Macedonian elements are not majority there. Around this small core, Greeks from conquered cities, Thracian mercenaries, Mesopotamians, Iranians, and even horse archers from the steppes of Central Asia were added. We must not forget to also count the caravan that follows the army with thousands of women, children, doctors, stewards, administrators. It must be said that where the emperor goes, the whole imperial capital moves, and that on foot, on chariot, on horseback. The army crosses the Hindu Kush Mountains in present-day Afghanistan, which marks the border between the ancient Persian Empire and the Indian subcontinent. The men have to fight several times, looting and burning the cities that resist their advance. Aware of the formidable power of his army, several Indian kings come to meet Alexander to pledge their allegiance to him. These new allies serve as much as guides as reinforcements to continue the campaign. Alexander therefore sends some of them to the front to open the road for the convoys and build boats on the Indus River. But on the other side of the river is the territory of King Omphis. Of course, Omphis accepts to offer hospitality to the Macedonians, but in exchange for a small service. Omphis is at war with King Poros, who reigns further east. Couldn't the gigantic army get rid of this cumbersome neighbor? Poros reigns over a territory that is now called the Chuj Doab, a part of the Punjab bounded by the rivers of Hydaspes, the present Jhelum, and Akesines, which today is called Chenab. It is only a small kingdom under this gigantic continent, but Omphis assures that Poros all the same has a rather impressive army. Alexander, very interested, accepts, but he prefers to receive bids than to have to fight. So he sends an emissary to Poros to ask him to come and meet him at the border of his territory and recognize his authority. Poros, not fearful, not practical, rather presumptuous, agrees to come to meet Alexander at the border of his kingdom. But he specifies it all the same just in case. He will be accompanied by his whole army and will put a good beating on the so-called King of Kings. So Alexander walks toward the Hydaspes, the river that marks the border of the two kingdoms. It's been 8 years since the Greeks left home, 5,000 kilometers away. The confrontation which they're preparing was related by two of its protagonists, the commander Ptolemy and the engineer Aristobulus. Many ancient authors have taken up their account, so much so that this important event of Alexander's epic has become a legend. It's the continuity of these writings that allows me to tell you the battle in detail. We are at the end of April or beginning of May 326 BC. When the Macedonian army reaches the Hydaspes, Poros already occupies the other bank, preventing any crossing. The Macedonians can see 200 war elephants, formidable creatures that they had never had to face. Behind support 4,000 horsemen and chariots, and 30,000 men on foot. King Poros stands on an elephant more massive than the others, adorned with gold and rich draperies, Poros being himself particularly tall. This presentation gives him a supernatural aspect which strikes the men of Alexander. Perplexity, even fear, starts to spread in the Macedonian ranks. The enemy is numerous and determined. The river, swollen by floods, is several hundred meters wide and agitated by violent currents. The elephants are excited by the Indians, and they make abominable trumpeting noises. They begin to wonder if it is really worth crossing the icy water on rafts to end up trampled by mastodons enraged by arrows. So some people ask, what the hell are we doing here? The most daring still swim to an island in the middle of the river, but the troops of Poros, who have already taken position, riddle them with arrows and slingshot bullets. The survivors, while trying to flee, are swallowed up by the current. Crossing seems impossible. Alexander then devises a stratagem. Like the Allies during the Second World War, he will deceive the enemy about the landing site. He counts on the help of 3 commanders. The first one, Attale, who looks a lot like him, wears his clothes and positions himself in full view of the Indian watchers. He erects the royal tent and the pavilions of the commanders facing the enemy. The second one, Ptolemy, takes position downstream of the river and begins false preparations for embarkation. His horsemen make noise all night long so that the diversion is complete. And on the third day, Craterus takes the lead of the main army. His orders are to cross only when the threat of the elephants is over. Meanwhile, Alexander goes alone with a detachment of the army, about 10,000 infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry, much further up the river, in front of an island where trees grow that will be able to hide his advance. A storm prevents his first attempt to cross the river, but at nightfall, a favorable fog rises from the river. It is ideal. The whole troop crosses, losing only one raft. The success is total. However, when Poros learns it the following morning, he is persuaded to have to deal with a course diversion. For him, Alexander is still on the other side with the bulk of his troops. He sends only a small detachment of cavalry and chariots commanded by his son. But the storm of the day before has made the ground muddy, and the Indian chariots, very heavy because they carry 6 men, can't maneuver. The Macedonians massacre them, and the son of Poros is killed. The latter reacts immediately, taking a defensive position. He positions his elephants in the first line, spaced about 30 meters apart. Behind them, the infantry battalions fill the gaps left between the elephants. On the wings, the horsemen and chariots are deployed, but they do not move for fear of bogging down his other chariots or his elephants. He stands still, waiting. It is the best thing to do, and yet it is his worst error, because the Macedonian cavalry is very experienced and knows perfectly how to maneuver around the enemy. These excellent mounted archers from the Central Asian steppes are very efficient. Alexander bypasses the enemy's strong points. It is out of the question to charge the elephants head-on. He prefers to aim at the weakness of their position by dividing his cavalry to wrap the flanks of the Indian army. The phalanxes, these infantry battalions armed with very long spears, must stay out of the fight as long as the center of Poros remains in battle order. The cavalry lands the first blow. Circumvention and destabilization work perfectly. The exposed foot soldiers of Poros fall back hastily around the elephants. The space tightens up for the Indian army. Except that the elephants are not inanimate defensive towers. On the contrary, the long spears of the phalangists are starting to get on their nerves, and the Indians are right at their feet. Alexander grasps the situation, especially since his horses, frightened by the trumpeting noises, refuse to advance further. He uses light infantry, specialists of skirmishes, to keep them at a distance by riddling them with arrows. The pachyderms are then pierced by the spears of the heavy infantry, and taken of panic, they charge blindly, crushing many Greek soldiers. But they do as much or even more damage in their own ranks. Honestly, at this point, victory is already almost within reach, but Alexander's little detached guard starts to get tired. That's when the genius of the plan comes to light. Since the elephants are occupied, Craterus quietly makes his way across the river with the bulk of the Macedonian army. This huge reinforcement gives a second wind to the attackers, and they need it. The energy of the monstrous beasts of war is phenomenal. They endure many wounds, but continue to struggle throughout the day. Attacks and retreats follow one another for hours. Finally, the Macedonians, without pity, decide to expedite the work. They attack the legs of the poor elephants with axes, as to cut down tree trunks. Poros refuses to flee, constantly recognizing the few troops he has left. Wounded, he finally decides to retreat on the back of his superb elephant, accompanied only by his close guard. He withdraws, but Alexander launches himself in pursuit. His faithful steed Bucephalus launches out in a race against the large elephant. But, too old, covered with wounds, the legendary steed collapses, dead of exhaustion. And the elephant too, huh? The Greeks surround the last guards. Poros is about to die, but the emperor, merciful, offers him to surrender, and defeated and wounded, he can only accept. Conquering is not enough. After the battle, it's still necessary to have some form of continuity. Alexander always has two objectives: to stabilize his conquest and especially reach the ocean. The first point is rather easy. Poros, having proved his value in battle, is spared and keeps his sovereignty, thus becoming an ally. And yes, it's easier to rely on a power already in place than to manage everything yourself. So the conquest can go on. But the second point is not so obvious. Of course, Alexander, victorious, still covers hundreds of kilometers, crosses a second tributary of the Indus, and even razes the city of Sangala. But when he reaches the third tributary, the Bea, the army refuses to advance. It's mutiny. Indeed, the more they advance, the more the Macedonians become aware of the problem. The kingdom of Poros, it was only a very, very small piece of a huge continent. They are not at all about to reach the ocean as they had imagined. In fact, they're just approaching the Ganges, the largest river in India, and there lies the empire of the king Dhanananda. His army numbers 20,000 horsemen, 200,000 infantrymen, and several thousand war elephants. And Poros is there to confirm that these numbers are not exaggerated. Thanks to that, the soldiers of Alexander are desperate. An officer, Koenos, makes a long speech to beg the conqueror. Crushed by the monsoon rains, exhausted, deprived of supplies, and undermanned, they want to go home. India is too big, too populated, too far away. This is the fight of the year. What will the Lord of the Conquerors do about this moving plea? He does not let his anger explode, but withdraws into his tent to think, and he comes out only 3 days later. Finally, he makes a decision and tells them that their complaint is based on reason. Their speech wins. To continue would be suicidal. The formidable army will withdraw after a last look at the rising sun. They will take the way of the return obliquely towards the south, going down the Indus until the Indian Ocean. The military expedition of Alexander will thus never reach the heart of India, only touching its periphery. All this because of the battle exhaustion of the Hydaspes, a wonderful paradox of history. Alexander versus Poros. It's the unlikely clash at the foot of the Himalayas of two characters with everything opposed. The old king who tries to defend his lands against the young conqueror in search of eternal glory. It is the sudden and violent eruption of the Greek world in the Indian world, whereas they did not even know each other before. As a result, many cities are razed to the ground, but also a new knowledge of the roads linking Europe to India and elsewhere. We have ceramics with Greek motifs that were later found in the Ganges Valley, proof of the intense frequentation of these new trade routes. Hydaspes is also a brilliant victorious battle, which pushes the winner to stop the war. Because at the end of the day, one of Alexander's objectives was achieved. He entered legend. He went further than any other conqueror. In fact, before he turned back, he had altars and oversized statues erected along the river to commemorate his expedition, as if to make future generations believe that only gigantic supermen could have accomplished such epic feats. Thank you all for following this episode. Thanks to Luc Apacot for his precious help in writing it. I hope that you enjoyed it, that you will like it, and that you will share it around. And of course, subscribe to Nota Bene.